CEO boss calls wrong number. The woman who answers changes his life forever. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from. And if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The hum of the server banks was the only sound that acknowledged the lateness of the hour, a low thrum of power that mimicked the frantic pulse in Christian Sterling's temple. He stood before the panoramic window of his boardroom on the 70th floor, the city below a glittering tapestry of circuits, and light that he had once believed he owned. Now, each pinprick of illumination felt like a mocking eye, watching as his empire, Sterling Enterprises, teetered on the brink of a hostile takeover. Damian Vance, a predator in a bespoke suit, was circling, and for the first time in a decade of ruthless ascension, Christian felt the cold chill of potential failure. He loosened the knot of his tie, the silk a constricting band against his throat, and pulled his phone from his pocket. He needed Marcus, his head of security, a man whose loyalty was as sharp and uncomplicated as a blade. His thumbs swiped across the screen, his movements jerky with adrenaline and a lack of sleep, and he pressed the call button on the familiar contact, lifting the cold glass to his ear. The ringing felt distant, a hollow signal in the oppressive silence of his office. He expected the clipped, professional greeting of his security chief. He did not expect the soft, tired voice that answered. "Hello." It was a woman's voice, warm and slightly husky, like aged whiskey poured over velvet. It was so out of place in his sterile, 2 a.m. reality that Christian pulled the phone away to stare at the screen, confirming he had somehow, impossibly, misdialed. He had tapped the contact just below Marcus's, a number he did not recognize. He should have hung up, dismissed it as an error born of exhaustion, but something in her tone held him captive. It was the sound of genuine weariness, not the brittle fatigue of corporate warfare, but a deeper, more human exhaustion. He brought the phone back to his ear. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended, a reflex of a man accustomed to being in command of every interaction. There was a pause on the other end, a small intake of breath. "I think you have the wrong number," she said, her voice remaining steady, calm. "Who were you trying to reach?" He could hear a faint, rhythmic beeping in the background, a sound that spoke of late nights and institutional corridors, a world away from his glass tower. "It doesn't matter," he said, his frustration momentarily eclipsing his intrigue. "It was a mistake." He should hang up. He knew he should. But the chaos of his thoughts, the relentless calculations of stock prices and shareholder votes, seemed to recede, pushed back by the simple, unassuming sound of her presence. Megan held the receiver of the nurse's station phone, her gaze fixed on the monitor displaying her son's vitals in the room down the hall. Leo's small chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, a sight that was both a comfort and a constant, aching reminder of the fragility of his health. The man on the phone had a voice like polished granite, cold and commanding, yet threaded with a tension so palpable she could almost feel it through the line. A wrong number at this hour was usually a drunk or a prank, but this felt different. This felt like a fissure opening into someone else's crisis. "All right," she said softly, her nurse's instinct to soothe kicking in. "I hope you find who you're looking for." She was about to place the phone back in its cradle when his voice stopped her, less a command now and more a raw, unfiltered question. "Do you ever feel like you're holding the whole world up and your hands are starting to slip?" The question was so unexpected, so intensely vulnerable, that it bypassed all her defenses. She looked again at her son's sleeping form, the tubes and wires a cruel mockery of childhood, and felt a profound, immediate kinship with the stranger on the phone. She knew precisely what that felt like. It was the story of her life. Christian did not know why he had said it. The words had escaped him, a confession torn from a place of desperation he refused to show to anyone, least of all the sharks who swam in his world. He expected her to hang up, to dismiss him as a lunatic. Instead, he heard her exhale, a long, slow sigh that was not of pity, but of understanding. "Every single day," she answered, her voice losing its guarded edge and settling into something intimate and real. "Sometimes I think my fingernails are going to break from holding on so tight." For the next 10 minutes they spoke. He never said his name, and she never offered hers. He spoke of pressure, of betrayals lurking in familiar faces, of the crushing weight of responsibility, couching his corporate battle in metaphors of storms and sieges. She spoke of hope as a flickering candle, of watching over something infinitely precious, of finding strength in the quiet, lonely hours before the dawn. She did not offer solutions or platitudes. She simply listened, her quiet affirmations a balm on the jagged edges of his anxiety. The beeping in the background became a strange, comforting metronome to their conversation. Her voice, her presence, was an anchor in the swirling vortex of his life. He found himself breathing deeper, the knot in his chest loosening for the first time in weeks. When a different sound, a soft chime, interrupted her, she apologized. "I have to go," she said, a note of genuine regret in her voice. "My break is over." A sudden panic seized him. He could not let her go. He needed to know who she was. "Wait," he said, his voice urgent. "What's your name?" There was a hesitation. He heard her caution return, the shield sliding back into place. A stranger on the phone in the middle of the night. "It's me," she said. "Me Johnson." It was a small lie, a simple transposition of her middle name for her first, a flimsy shield against an intensity that both unnerved and intrigued her. "I really have to go." And before he could say another word, the line went dead, leaving him in the profound silence of his office, the echo of her voice lingering in the air like a phantom limb. Christian Sterling, a man who controlled billions of dollars and the fates of thousands of employees, stared at the blank screen of his phone, consumed by a single, overriding thought. He had to find Me Johnson. The call became a fixation, a puzzle his analytical mind could not let go of. The rhythmic beeping, he realized after a moment of reflection, was the sound of a hospital monitor. The weariness in her voice was that of a caregiver. Using the number she had called from and the time of the call, it took his private security team less than an hour to trace the signal to a specific nurse's station on the Pediatric Oncology and Respiratory Ward of City General Hospital. It took them another hour to cross-reference the on-duty staff roster with public records. There was no Me Johnson. There was, however, a Megan Thorne, whose middle name was Me, and whose profile picture on a forgotten social media page matched the warm, determined voice he could not get out of his head. He learned she was a widow, a registered nurse, and the single mother of a 7-year-old boy named Leo Thorne, who was currently a long-term patient on that very ward, being treated for cystic fibrosis. The pieces clicked into place with the cold, satisfying precision of a well-oiled machine. Her exhaustion was not just from her job. It was the bone-deep weariness of a mother fighting a battle for her child's life. The lie about her name was not a deception, but a defense. The knowledge, instead of sating his curiosity, only deepened his obsession. He now had a name and a face for the voice that had pulled him back from the edge, and he was a man who always collected on his debts. Christian moved with the quiet, devastating efficiency that had built his fortune. He did not approach Megan directly. That would be too crude, too alarming. Instead, he acted as a ghost in the machine of her life, a benevolent force she would feel but not see. He had his financial analysts conduct a thorough but discreet investigation into her situation. The results were grimly predictable. She was drowning. Her nurse's salary was barely enough to cover rent on her tiny high-rise apartment and basic necessities, let alone the staggering, uncovered costs of Leo's specialized treatments and medications. She was one catastrophic appliance failure away from complete financial ruin, a reality that sharpened the edges of his protective instinct into a fine, dangerous point. He made a single phone call to the director of the Sterling Foundation, his company's philanthropic arm. Within a day, City General Hospital received a substantial, anonymous donation specifically earmarked to create a new grant for families of pediatric patients with chronic respiratory illnesses. The first recipient, chosen by the hospital's board for her overwhelming need, was Megan Thorne. Her entire outstanding medical debt, a sum that had haunted her sleep for years, was wiped clean. Megan stared at the letter from the hospital's financial aid office, her hands trembling so violently that the words swam before her eyes. Paid in full. It felt like a dream, a cruel joke. She read it again, and then a third time, the meaning slowly seeping into her exhausted mind. The weight that had been crushing her chest for as long as she could remember suddenly lifted, leaving her lightheaded and breathless. She sank onto the worn sofa in her small apartment, tears of disbelief and relief streaming down her face. It was a miracle, an impossible, life-altering miracle. But as the initial shock subsided, a sliver of suspicion began to creep in. Miracles like this did not just happen. People like her, People who lived on the knife's edge of poverty did not just have their burdens magically erased. She went to the hospital administration, her gratitude warring with a deep-seated skepticism. They were kind but vague, speaking of a new grant from an anonymous benefactor, a stroke of incredible luck. But Megan had learned long ago that luck was a fickle and often cruel illusion. The feeling that she was being watched, that this was not an act of chance but one of calculated intent, began to take root in her mind. A week later, Christian made his move. He waited for her outside the hospital at the end of her shift, standing beside his sleek, black sedan that seemed to absorb the gray light of the early morning. He was exactly as his public photos depicted, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his presence radiating an aura of contained power that was both intimidating and magnetic. His sharp blue eyes found hers across the rain-slicked pavement, and he did not smile. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. Megan stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized him instantly. Christian Sterling was a local legend, a tech titan whose face was plastered on business magazines and news sites. She had no idea what he would want with her, but the timing, so close to her financial miracle, sent a jolt of alarm through her. He crossed the street, his movements fluid and purposeful, and stopped a respectful distance from her. "Megan Thorne," he said, his voice the same one from the phone call, that same polished granite, but this time it was directed at her, pinning her in place. "We spoke on the phone last week." Her instinctive denial died on her lips. The lie about her name felt foolish and transparent now. "I know," she whispered, clutching the strap of her tote bag. "It was you," she stated, the suspicion in her gut solidifying into certainty. "The hospital bills." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "A loose end. I don't like leaving them." "This isn't a loose end," she countered, finding a spark of defiance. "This is my life, my son's life. Why would you do that?" He took a step closer, and she had to fight the urge to retreat. His proximity was overwhelming, a physical manifestation of the power he wielded so effortlessly. "Because your voice for 10 minutes was the most valuable asset I possessed," he said, his tone low and intense. "It bought me clarity. I am a man who believes in paying a fair market price for services rendered." His explanation was so transactional, so devoid of emotion, that it was almost more unsettling than a direct threat. He was framing his intrusion into her life as a business deal, one she had unwittingly entered into. He wanted to see her again, he told her, not a request but a statement of fact. He was hosting the annual Sterling Enterprises Technology Gala at his Skyline penthouse, a major event in the city's corporate calendar. He wanted her to be there as his guest. Megan refused, the idea so preposterous she almost laughed. Her world was one of fluorescent lights and disinfectant, of thrift store cardigans and the constant, low-grade hum of medical equipment. His was a world of champagne and whispered power plays, a universe away from her own. Christian was relentless. He did not threaten or cajole. He simply dismantled her objections with cold, irrefutable logic. He had already purchased a dress for her, had it delivered to her apartment from the most exclusive boutique in the city. A car would be sent. A trusted babysitting service, vetted by his own security team, would be arranged to stay with Leo in his hospital room. He framed it as another part of their transaction. Her presence at the gala would serve a purpose for him, and in return, he would continue to ensure that Leo received the absolute best medical care money could buy, pulling strings to get him into experimental treatment programs that were previously far beyond her reach. He was offering her son a chance at a real future, and the price was a single evening of her time. It was a temptation she could not afford to resist, a devil's bargain she had no choice but to accept. The night of the gala, she felt like an imposter in her own skin. The dress was a midnight blue silk that clung to her curves, a stark contrast to her usual scrubs and worn-out jeans. The diamonds he had sent, a simple necklace and earrings, felt cold against her skin. When Christian saw her, a flicker of something unguarded crossed his face, a raw appreciation that made her breath catch. In his penthouse, with the city lights spread out beneath them like a carpet of fallen stars, she was plunged into his world. The air was thick with the scent of money and ambition. Men and women with predatory smiles sized her up, their eyes lingering on her, then on Christian, speculation and envy in their gazes. It was there she saw Damian Vance for the first time. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp-featured way, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. He approached them, his focus entirely on Christian, but his dismissive glance at Megan was a calculated insult. "Sterling," Vance said, his voice smooth. "I'm surprised to see you looking so relaxed. I would have thought you'd be liquidating assets by now." Christian's hand rested on the small of Megan's back, a gesture that was both possessive and protective. "I find I do my best work when I'm relaxed, Damien," Christian replied, his voice lethally calm. "You, on the other hand, always seem to be trying too hard. It reeks of desperation." The exchange was brief, but the animosity between them was a palpable force. Megan realized then that she was not just a guest. She was a message. Her presence, so unexpected and out of place, was a move in their high-stakes game, a signal to his rival that Christian was not distracted or weakened, but was instead confident enough to be indulging in a personal life. She was a pawn. The thought should have angered her, but as she stood beside him, feeling the warmth of his hand through the thin silk of her dress, all she felt was the dizzying, terrifying pull of his power and the undeniable temptation of the safety it promised. The fragile truce between Megan's world and Christian was shattered by the ghost of her past. Rick, her ex-boyfriend and Leo's biological father, materialized outside the hospital one afternoon, looking just as he always had. A little too slick, a little too desperate, his charm curdled by years of bad decisions and resentment. He had been absent for years, a phantom figure who sent neither birthday cards nor child support, but news of Megan's sudden association with Christian Sterling had traveled fast through the city's gossiping underbelly. He cornered her near the parking garage, his smile a predatory baring of teeth. He had seen the articles, the photos from the gala. He spoke of parental rights, of his deep and abiding love for the son he had never bothered to visit, his words a transparent prelude to blackmail. He wanted money, a substantial sum, or he would drag her through a messy, public custody battle, smearing her name and painting Christian as a homewrecker who was tearing a family apart. The threat was a cold stone in Megan's stomach. A public fight was the last thing she wanted, and she knew Rick was just cruel enough to use Leo as a weapon without a second thought for the damage he would cause. When she told Christian what had happened, his expression became frighteningly still. The warmth and intensity she had begun to see in his eyes were replaced by something cold and absolute, the look of a predator identifying its prey. He asked for Rick's full name, his last known address, and his place of employment. He said nothing more, simply told her not to worry, that he would handle it. For 2 days, an unnerving silence followed. Megan was on edge, expecting a furious phone call from Rick, a summons from a lawyer, but there was nothing. On the 3rd day, she learned why. A friend who worked in the same industry as Rick called her, whispering about the sudden, catastrophic implosion of his life. He had been fired from his sales job for falsifying expense reports, an internal audit having mysteriously been triggered. The apartment complex where he lived had served him an eviction notice for multiple lease violations that had previously been ignored. The Internal Revenue Service had suddenly taken a keen interest in his undeclared cash income from the last 5 years. Within 72 hours, Rick's life had been systematically and completely dismantled, not with a punch or a public threat, but with the silent, invisible weapons of information and influence. He was ruined, tangled in a web of legal and financial troubles so thick he would spend years trying to claw his way out. He would never be a threat to her or Leo again. Christian never spoke of the details, but Megan knew, with chilling certainty, that it was his work. She saw in that moment the true nature of his power. It was not just the wealth to buy dresses and pay hospital bills. It was the ruthless, terrifying ability to unmake a man's life with a few quiet phone calls. It was the calculated, brutal efficiency of a mafia boss protecting his territory. The realization should have sent her running, but instead, it stirred a complex and disturbing mix of fear and gratitude. He had shielded her, had wielded his darkness to protect her light, and a part of her was drawn to that absolute, unwavering loyalty. That evening, he came to the hospital, finding her in the small, quiet chapel where she sometimes went to escape the relentless noise and antiseptic smell of the ward. He looked tired, the hard lines of his face softened by the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. He sat beside her in the worn wooden pew, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken things. It was there, surrounded by symbols of faith and forgiveness, that he finally showed her the wound he carried. He told her about his sister, Alina. She had been younger than him by 5 years, bright and full of life, and she had been diagnosed with the same disease that afflicted Leo. His family had been working class, without the means or the connections to secure the kind of cutting-edge care that might have saved her. He had been a teenager, watching helplessly as his parents drowned in debt and despair, watching his sister's light slowly fade. He had held her hand as she took her last breath in a crowded, underfunded public hospital, not so different from this one. "I promised myself that day," he said, his voice low and hoarse with a grief that was still raw after all these years, "that I would never be helpless again, that I would build a fortress of wealth and power so high that nothing and no one I cared about could ever be touched by the kind of random, cruel fate that took her." His entire life, his relentless ambition, his ruthless pursuit of success, it was all penance. It was all a desperate, unending effort to build a wall against the memory of that loss. He was not just protecting Megan and Leo, he was trying to save the sister he had failed. In his confession, Megan finally understood the man behind the myth. He was not a monster, but a man forged in the crucible of profound pain. His ruthlessness was the armor he wore to protect a deeply scarred heart. All the barriers between them crumbled in that moment. The fear she felt of his power was eclipsed by a wave of empathy so strong it left her aching. She saw the lonely boy still grieving his sister, the man who used money and control as a shield against the unbearable fragility of life. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. His hand was cold, but it trembled slightly at her touch. She did not offer words of comfort. There were none that would suffice. Instead, she offered him the simple, profound gift of her presence, a silent acknowledgement of his pain. He turned his head and looked at her, his sharp blue eyes shimmering with an unshed emotion that he had likely not allowed himself to feel in years. In the quiet sanctity of the chapel, his defenses finally fell away, and he leaned in, drawn to her warmth as if she were the only source of light in his gilded, lonely world. The kiss was not one of passion, but of desperation and recognition, a meeting of two wounded souls who had found in each other an unexpected and terrifying hope. The kiss in the chapel was a fulcrum, the point on which their entire relationship shifted. The careful boundaries they had erected, the pretense of a transaction, dissolved into something far more potent and complicated. Christian's visits to the hospital became a regular occurrence, his imposing figure a familiar sight to the night shift nurses. He would sit with her for hours during her breaks, not in the sterile cafeteria, but in the quiet solitude of Leo's room, watching the boys sleep. He learned the rhythms of her life, the delicate dance of medications and respiratory treatments, the small victories and the heartbreaking setbacks. He never offered pity. Instead, he offered a steady, unwavering presence that became the bedrock of her chaotic world. Their conversations deepened, moving from the abstract pressures of his life and the concrete worries of hers to the landscape of their pasts, their fears, their fragile dreams for the future. He showed her a side of himself that the world never saw, a wry sense of humor, a fierce intellect that went beyond business, and a surprising gentleness when he spoke about Leo. Their intimacy grew not in grand, dramatic gestures, but in the quiet moments between the crises. It was in the way he would bring her a specific type of coffee he learned she liked, the way his hand would find hers as they watched Leo's monitors, the way he would listen, truly listen, as she spoke about her day. One night, after a particularly grueling shift where Leo had suffered a bad episode, Megan was utterly spent, her emotional reserves depleted. Christian took her home, and for the first time he did not leave her at the door. He followed her into the tiny apartment that felt even smaller with his presence filling it. He didn't speak, just took her into his arms and held her as she finally let herself break, her silent, exhausted sobs absorbed by the fine wool of his suit. It was a moment of complete surrender, an admission that she could not carry the weight alone anymore. He led her to her bed, and what followed was not just an act of physical passion, but a continuation of that surrender. It was a slow, tender exploration, a desperate, beautiful collision of two people starved for connection, each finding solace and a fierce, protective love in the arms of the other. In the aftermath, lying tangled in the sheets as the first light of dawn painted the sky, Megan knew she was irrevocably in love with him. He made her a promise, his voice a low murmur against her hair. He promised her a future where she would never have to be afraid again, a future where Leo would have access to any doctor, any treatment, anywhere in the world. He promised her a life of safety and security, a fortress built just for them. It was everything she had ever wanted, a fantasy she had never allowed herself to entertain. But the price of living in that fortress was becoming terrifyingly clear. Damian Vance, frustrated by Christian's unshakable defense in the boardroom, had turned his attention to a new front: Christian's personal life. His investigators, relentless and thorough, had finally pieced together the identity of the mystery woman at his side. They dug into Megan's past, her financial struggles, Rick's sudden disappearance from the scene. It was a perfect narrative for a predator like Vance. He began to leak stories to the tabloid press, carefully curated and venomously slanted. The first articles were subtle, hinting at a secret new woman in the billionaire's life. Then came the photos, long-lens shots of Christian entering her modest apartment building late at night, a picture of them talking closely outside the hospital. The story exploded into a full-blown scandal. Megan was cast as the opportunistic gold digger, the scheming nurse who had ensnared a powerful man. Her quiet, anonymous life was annihilated overnight. Reporters ambushed her outside the hospital, shouting invasive questions. Photographers lurked near her apartment, their flashes like a hostile barrage. Her colleagues at the hospital began to look at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Her name, once a source of pride, was now tabloid fodder, her life twisted into a sordid caricature for public consumption. The onslaught was brutal and relentless, a calculated attack designed to destabilize Christian by painting him as foolish and compromised, his judgment clouded by an inappropriate affair. For Megan, the price of his promise was the complete evisceration of her privacy and her reputation. The safety he offered inside their bubble was absolute, but the world outside had become a war zone. She began to question if she was strong enough to withstand the siege, if she had the right to subject her son to this kind of scrutiny. One evening, hounded and exhausted, she confronted Christian in his sterile, silent penthouse, a world away from the chaos on the streets below. "Is this what it's like?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. "Is this the safety you promised? To be torn apart by vultures so your enemy can score a point?" Christian's face was a mask of cold fury, but his anger was not directed at her. It was aimed at Vance and at himself for allowing her to be exposed to this. "I will end this," he swore, pulling her into an embrace that felt more like a vow than a comfort. "I will destroy him for what he has done to you." But as she stood there, wrapped in his arms, Megan knew it wasn't that simple. She loved him, but she had to decide if his love was worth the cost of her own identity, and if the fortress he had built for them was a sanctuary or a gilded cage. The final blow from Damian Vance was not delivered through the press or the stock market, but through the quiet, bureaucratic channels of the hospital. He had spent years cultivating influence, placing allies on the boards of the city's most powerful institutions, including City General. With a few strategic whispers and a carefully worded concern about conflicts of interest, he put Leo's position in the cutting-edge gene therapy trial in jeopardy. The program, which Christian had fought to get him into, and which represented his best hope for a long-term future, was suddenly under review. The hospital administration, bowing to pressure from a powerful board member, informed Megan that Leo might be deemed an unsuitable candidate due to the unprecedented media attention surrounding his mother's personal life. It was a move of breathtaking cruelty, a direct and undeniable threat against the life of her child. The message was clear: walk away from Christian, or your son pays the price. When Megan told Christian, the rage that emanated from him was a cold, silent inferno. It was a pressure drop in the room, a terrifying stillness that preceded a storm. She saw in his eyes the flicker of the man who had dismantled Rick's life, the man who would burn the world down to protect his own. For a terrifying moment, she thought he would retaliate with the same brutal, extra-legal force, that he would send men to break Vance or ruin him in a way from which he could never recover. She saw the abyss that had always existed within him, the darkness forged by his sister's death, and she feared it would consume him completely. But as he stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, something shifted in his gaze. He looked from the fury on his face to the terror on hers, and then his eyes drifted as if seeing Leo's small, trusting face. The violent storm within him did not so much recede as it was channeled, focused from a blunt instrument of rage into a laser of pure, calculated strategy. He would not become the monster Vance wanted him to be. He would not win by sinking to his level. He would win by being smarter, more patient, and infinitely more disciplined. For the next 48 hours, Christian disappeared into the heart of his empire. He gathered his most loyal legal, financial, and forensic data teams, locking them in the boardroom with him. He did not sleep. Fueled by black coffee and a cold, righteous fury, he orchestrated a counterattack of such brilliance and complexity that it would be studied in business schools for years to come. He had long suspected Vance of corporate espionage and market manipulation, but had never had the impetus to dedicate the full, overwhelming resources of his company to proving it. Now, he did. His teams sifted through terabytes of data, followed obscure money trails, and pieced together a mosaic of corruption that was staggering in its scope. They uncovered proof of insider trading, illegal offshore accounts, and a conspiracy to sabotage Sterling Enterprises' stock price using fabricated data. It was all there, a web of criminality hidden behind a veneer of corporate legitimacy. But Christian didn't just leak the information. He built an airtight, irrefutable legal case. On the morning of the Sterling Enterprises board meeting, where Vance was set to make his final push for the takeover, Christian did not walk in with a defense. He walked in with federal agents. The takedown was surgical and silent. Damian Vance was arrested in the middle of the boardroom, his expression of smug triumph turning to one of slack-jawed disbelief as handcuffs were snapped onto his wrists. The evidence was so overwhelming that his corporate empire crumbled within hours. The scandal was not about a billionaire's love life. It was about massive, systemic fraud. In one brilliant, decisive move, Christian had not only saved his company and destroyed his rival, but he had done so on the right side of the law, proving that his greatest weapon was not his ruthlessness, but his intellect. With Vance's influence gone, the threat to Leo's place in the treatment program evaporated. The hospital administration, now painfully aware of who their true benefactor was, fell over themselves to apologize and ensure Leo received the best possible care. The media, scenting a bigger, more explosive story, turned their attention away from Megan and onto the spectacular implosion of Vance's company. The storm had passed. That evening, Christian came home to the penthouse. He looked exhausted but calm, the cold fire in his eyes replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. Megan met him at the door, her heart full of a love so deep it ached. He had faced his demons and chosen a different path. He had wielded his immense power not for destruction, but for protection, for justice. He had reshaped his methods for her, for them. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "It's over," he murmured. A few weeks later, he made an announcement that shocked the business world. He was stepping back from the day-to-day operations of Sterling Enterprises, promoting his trusted second-in-command to Chief Executive Officer. His new primary focus would be the newly launched Alina Sterling Foundation for Pediatric Health, a multi-billion-dollar initiative dedicated to funding research and providing care for children with chronic illnesses, ensuring no family would ever have to suffer the way his had. He was reshaping his empire, turning its power from the accumulation of wealth to the preservation of life. The story ends not with a grand wedding or a dramatic public declaration, but with a quiet, perfect moment of peace. Months have passed. Leo's treatment is working, his laughter echoing through the spacious penthouse that has become their home. One evening, Megan stands with Christian on the balcony, the city lights glittering below them, no longer mocking eyes but a beautiful, shared vista. Leo is asleep inside, breathing easily and deeply. Christian wraps his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. They don't speak for a long time, simply watching the city breathe around them. The world he had once sought to conquer was now just a backdrop to the small, perfect world he had built with her. The wrong number had not just changed his life, it had saved it, dialing him into a future he never knew he wanted. Here, in the quiet of the evening, high above the world, the ruthless chief executive officer and the night shift nurse had found their earned and lasting peace.